She lost her partner in war but found love in the human who was meant to be. Her enemy, she watched him die in the cold between stars. And the human standing across from her, the one who was supposed to finish the job, put down his weapon and asked if she was okay. That was the moment. Everything changed. That was the moment. Vexa of the K Collective realized she understood absolutely nothing about the species that had just destroyed her fleet. The KTH did not start wars. That was the first thing you needed to understand about them. They were a civilization 4,000 years old, with faster-than-light travel, quantum lattice computing, and a social architecture so precisely engineered that the concept of violence had been effectively bred out of their culture. Over the span of 12 generations, they communicated through layered resonance tones, a language built on harmony rather than friction. They had no word in their native tongue for enemy. They had 57 words for colleague. So when their long-range exploratory vessel threshold him crossed the outer boundary of what they had cataloged as uninhabited space and encountered a human military picket line, the KE did what the Cath always did. They broadcast to greeting frequency. They transmitted mathematical sequences. They offered resource coordinates and navigational data as a gesture of good faith. The humans opened fire in 11 seconds. Not because they were savage, not because they were thoughtless, but because they had been at war with the Vorith Dominion, a species that wore the same resonance broadcast signatures the KE used for 6 years. And in those 6 years, the Vorith had used fake greeting frequencies as a tactical deception 18 separate times before a real firefight. 11 seconds was actually longer than the standard response protocol. It meant someone on that human ship had hesitated. That hesitation cost them. The threshold him was not a warship, but it was KE built, and KE engineering had never once failed a stress test. Defensive plating absorbed 3 full salvos before the crew even processed what was happening. By the time Vexa, Chief Science Officer, 2nd tier, Resonance Scholar, and the closest thing the KE had to a field commander, understood that this was not a misidentification drill, her co-partner, Sorvith, had already been hit. Sorvith was more than a colleague. In Cath culture, a resonance partner was something untranslatable in human terms. Not a spouse exactly, not a best friend. Closer to the idea of a second self. Someone whose emotional frequency matched yours so precisely that you functioned better together than either of you did alone. Keith's children were tested at age 7 for resonance compatibility. Most went their whole lives without finding a true match. Vexa had found hers at 23. They had been partnered for 41 years. He died in her arms 17 minutes after the first shot was fired. His resonance tone, the specific harmonic hum she had felt in her chest every day for 4 decades, went silent. And Vexa of the Keth Collective, a being who had never once in her life contemplated an act of violence, sat in the ruins of her command deck and felt something ancient and enormous crack open inside her. The human boarding team came through the hull breach 8 minutes later. Here is what most stories about first contact get wrong. They assume the most dangerous moment is when weapons are raised. They're not. The most dangerous moment is the 3 seconds after the weapons come down, because that's when everything is decided. That's when Species either find a way to understand each other or they don't. And in the history of the K Collective, no first contact had ever reached this moment before. They had never needed to. Which means Vexa was walking into territory no K had ever mapped. Brutal, wordless space between two species that have just tried to kill each other and are now somehow still breathing in the same room. Sergeant Dio Okonkwo had run 17 boarding operations in 6 years of active duty. He knew what a hostile alien looked like. Under pressure, he knew the micro signals, the tensing of secondary appendages, the shift in vocalizations, the specific way a non-human predator tracked your center of mass right before it lunged. He'd learned to read all of it the hard way, in the kind of close-quarters chaos that left you either trained or dead. What he was not prepared for was walking through a breached hull into a devastated command room and finding an alien sitting on the floor holding a dead body, making a sound he had never heard in his life. A low cycling falling harmonic that somehow made his eyes sting even though he didn't understand a word of it. He stopped, his team fanned out into defensive positions. Standard protocol: sweep the room, secure the exits, identify threats, report. He did all of it on autopilot because his brain was occupied entirely with the question of what exactly he was witnessing. The alien, tall, silver gray with 4 upper limbs and a face like something between a crane and a human, huge amber eyes that reflected light in layers. Didn't move, didn't look at him, just kept holding the body and making that sound. Dio had grown up in Logos. He had a grandmother who sang to her dead. He recognized grief when he saw it, regardless of what shape it was wearing. He told his team to hold position. He unslung his rifle, placed it on the deck behind him, and crossed the room to the alien alone. He crouched down to her level. He didn't speak. He didn't have a translation matrix yet. They'd be lucky if linguistics got one running in the next 48 hours. So he just sat there in the rubble of a ship he had helped shoot down next to a being he'd been trying to kill 12 minutes ago, and he waited. Vexa became aware of the human. Gradually, the way you become aware of he'd. She registered his presence without looking at him. And then she realized what was wrong with him. He wasn't moving, he wasn't speaking, he wasn't doing anything, he was just there, present. The way Keth waited when someone was in grief, the specific culturally encoded stillness that said, I am not leaving you alone with this. A human was sitting Shiva for her in the ruins of the ship his people had just destroyed. Without knowing that's what he was doing, she looked at him for the first time. He looked back. His eyes were dark brown and very clear, his throat tired. And there was something in them that she would later, after months of translation work, after dozens of conversations, after learning to read human faces the way she had once read cath resonance harmonics, identify as guilt. Not the guilt of someone who thought they'd done wrong, the guilt of someone who knew they'd done what they had to do and hated that it was true. That distinction would take her 8 months to fully understand, but she felt the shape of it immediately, and it was the shape of something she recognized. It was the shape of someone who understood that the universe was not fair and had chosen to keep going. Anyway, you need to understand something about what came next. The cath had encountered 11 other spacefaring civilizations before humanity. Every single first contact had followed the same pattern: cautious broadcast, mathematical exchange, resource sharing, protocol, formal diplomatic opening. Every single one, 11 times. It had always worked. Humanity was the only species that had ever shot first. And somehow the KE diplomatic accord that came out of that encounter would become the most important document in the history of interstellar relations, not because of anything the diplomats did, because of what a sergeant from Lagos did in the ruins of a ship he'd helped destroy when he sat down next to someone in pain and refused to leave. They spent 6 weeks together on a combined vessel, human military frigate ISS Perseverance with a small KE module attached to its docking ring, while the diplomatic teams on both sides worked furiously to prevent the incident from becoming a full war. 6 weeks of enforced proximity, 6 weeks of Dio learning 40 words of KA resonance language, 6 weeks of Vexa attempting to understand why human communication was so relentlessly, aggressively, almost offensively direct. The KET spoke in layers. Every statement contained a surface meaning, an emotional subtext, and what they called a resonance implication. The thing you were communicating about. The relationship between speaker and listener. When Vexa said, "The temperature in this room is comfortable," she was simultaneously saying, "I am not under stress in your presence, and I consider this an exchange between equals." 3 layers in 6 words. Humans said what they meant, or they didn't say anything. Or sometimes they said the exact opposite of what they meant and expected you to know which one it was based on. Context. This drove Vexa to something approaching genuine madness. She filled 17 data logs trying to map the logic of human sarcasm. She could not find a logic. Dio told her there wasn't one. She told him that was impossible. He laughed. She cataloged the laugh for 6 days before she understood it was a compliment. Dio, for his part, was trying to work out why Vexa kept pausing for 4 to 7 seconds before answering any question. He thought he'd offended her repeatedly for the first 2 weeks. Turns out that in Cath culture, responding immediately to a statement was considered a sign that you hadn't fully processed what was said. Thoughtful pause was respect. A quick reply was borderline rude. Dio restructured his entire conversational style over the course of a month. His crew thought he'd had some kind of neurological event. But here is what nobody wrote in the diplomatic reports. Here is the thing that never made it into the formal account of the KETH human first contact. Incident Category 1. 3 weeks in, Vexa stopped eating. Not dramatically, not completely. She reduced her nutrient intake by 60% and her sleep cycles dropped from the standard KE 14 hours to under 4. She functioned. She attended every briefing, completed every translation session, performed every task assigned to her. She was the best diplomatic asset the KTH had, and everyone knew it, and she was slowly coming apart in a way that nobody on the human ship was equipped to see, because the signals were all wrong. For human grief, KTH and mourning didn't cry, they didn't withdraw, they overworked, they hyperfocused. They ran themselves into the ground so they didn't have to feel the silence where a resonance partner used to be. Dio noticed on a Tuesday. He noticed because he was the kind of person who noticed things, and because he'd been watching her for 3 weeks, and because the specific texture of her silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of someone thinking. It was the silence of someone holding something very heavy and trying not to let anyone see. He brought her food, human food, container of jollof rice that his mother had somehow gotten past the supply. Manifest 3 months ago, and he'd been saving for a morale emergency. He sat it down in front of her in the observation deck and sat next to her and looked out at the stars and said in terrible, badly pronounced Keth resonance tones, "You don't have to be okay." 4 words, arguably the most important 4 words ever spoken in the history of human-alien diplomacy. And she understood them. Not because his Keth was good, it was objectively catastrophic, the phrasing was almost nonsensical, but because the emotional frequency underneath them was unmistakable. She felt it land in the place where Sorb the resonance used to live. She told him about Sorb, all of it, 41 years, the way they'd first matched frequencies at a science academy on the second Cath home world, the specific tone. She described it as something between a cello and a radio tower. Warm and enormous and always there. The day they'd taken the threshold, him posting together because they'd mapped a region of space no K had ever charted. And they wanted to see it together, the way Sorf had been laughing about a navigational error he'd made, genuinely laughing, that low cycling harmonic that she'd heard thousands of times 11 minutes before the first shot hit. She talked for 4 hours. Dio listened for all of it. At the end, he told her about his brother Marcus, 26, killed in the second year of the Vareth War in a boarding action that went wrong. The way grief worked in his family, loud and collective all at once, everyone in the same room, nobody allowed to carry it alone. The way he'd had to learn to grieve differently out here in space, with no family and no community and just the grinding forward motion of duty. We have the same loss, Vexa said in queso. The translator had to work on it in completely different shapes. That was the sentence they used later when describing the philosophical foundation of the KE Human Accord. The KE ambassador's formal opening statement borrowed it directly. Every school child in the collective learned, yet it's carved into the entrance of the joint diplomatic station. At Vexa Point, Dio didn't know any of that was going to happen. He was just a sergeant eating bad reheated rice in an observation deck trying to help someone who was hurting. Let me tell you what made the KE human relationship different from every other first contact diplomatic opening in the historical record. Every other species the KE had encountered had asked at some point in the formal proceedings what humanity could offer in exchange for peace. The K asked the same question of humanity, and the human diplomatic team gave an answer that no one in the history of the collective had ever given before. The chief human negotiator looked at the Keth ambassador across that table and said, "We'll give you what we have, but we need to know what you need first." No species had ever led with a question instead of an offer. The KTH spent 3 days in closed session just processing that, because in 4,000 years of interstellar diplomacy, every species they'd ever met had led with capability. Humanity led with curiosity. And the KTH, who had spent 4,000 years talking to civilizations that had all The answers had no idea how much they needed someone to ask the right question. The Kth Human Accord was signed 8 months after the Threshold HIMYM incident. It was not a peace treaty. Technically, it was something the KET called a resonance compact, an agreement built not on what both sides would refrain from doing, but on what they would actively do for each other. The humans got navigational data for 17 unexplored sectors. The K got something harder to quantify: access to human medical trauma research, specifically the work on grief and loss that had been developed during the Vorith War for soldiers with combat PTSD. Nobody in the collective had ever needed that research before. 4,000 years of engineered social harmony had eliminated most psychological trauma at the systemic level. But Keth, who lost resonance partners, the rare few, the statistically unlikely tragedy, had no institutional framework for what came after. They had been quietly and without anyone acknowledging it, suffering alone. The human grief protocols adapted by KE psychologists over the following 2 years became standard collective support infrastructure. 12,000 Cath accessed those services in the first year alone. The resonance partner lost support network now serves over 300,000 individuals across the collective. It is entirely human in origin. Vexa was the first patient. She requested the protocol herself 6 weeks after the accord signing in a document she filed with the collective health ministry that is now somewhat embarrassingly for her required reading in diplomatic training programs. Her clinical description of resonance partner grief, precise, methodical, utterly key in its analytical rigor, is considered the foundational text of a medical specialty that didn't exist. Before she wrote it, she described her own breakdown with the same detachment she'd used to document a spectrographic anomaly. She noted Sergeant Okonkwo's intervention as an intuitively correct grief mitigation approach, possibly coincidental, possibly representative of deeper human social intelligence. The Cath Academy of Sciences made her a fellow for it. The paper made Dio's mother cry when the translation reached her. She said she'd always known he had sense. Dio was reassigned to the Joint Liaison Division, the newly formed Human Keth Diplomatic Military Coordination unit based partly on his performance during the Threshold HIM incident and partly because he was the only person in the entire Human Strategic Command who could hold a passable conversation in Resonance K. He spent the next 3 years on Vexa Point Station, mostly arguing with KET bureaucrats about supply chain logistics and occasionally winning, which made him something of a legend in both diplomatic communities. For entirely different reasons, he and Vexa didn't see each other for 8 months after the accord signing. Then she came to the station for a resonance language conference, and he was working the welcome detail, and they recognized each other immediately, and both stopped in the middle of a very crowded corridor, and 140 beings of various species had to walk around them while they stood there. 2 people from wildly different civilizations trying to figure out what you call the thing that you are too. Someone who sat with you while you grieved. The K didn't have a word for it. It wasn't a resonance partnership. Those were precise, frequency matched. Rare as diamonds. It wasn't a colleague. It wasn't a friend exactly, though they were friends. It wasn't family. It was something newer than all of those. Categories, Dio said they should. Probably just make up a word, Vexa said. That in K culture, inventing a new word was a serious philosophical undertaking, requiring extended formal justification. Dio said they had time. They spent 3 years on that word. In the end, the one they settled on was a hybrid, half resonance K, half English, combining the Keth concept of harmonic presence with the English word home. The translation doesn't work in either language alone. It requires both to mean what it means, which was, they decided, the whole point. Here is the thing about great losses and the people who come after them. Sorvith was irreplaceable. That was simply true. 41 years. Frequency match so precise that losing it was like losing a sense, like suddenly being unable to hear an entire range of sound that you'd built, your understanding of the world around. Vexa never stopped loving him. She never stopped missing the specific shape he left in the world. That is not what this story is about. This story is about what happens when you are in the wreckage of something enormous and a being from a completely different world with completely different values and completely different emotional architecture sits down next to you and doesn't leave. Not because they understand, but because they can see that you're in pain and they've decided that's reason enough to stay. That's not love exactly. Not yet. It's something that comes before love, something that makes love possible. The K, after 3 years of collaboration and approximately 411 hours of formal philosophical discussion, named it the willingness to remain legible to each other even when the language doesn't exist. They're still working on the second volume of that definition. Vexa says it'll take another decade. Dio says that's fine. He's not going anywhere. There is a plaque at the entrance to Vexa Point Station. It reads in 6 languages including Resonance Keth and 3 human dialects. We have the same loss in completely different shapes. We stay anyway. Below it in smaller text added by a station maintenance worker whose identity was never officially confirmed, but who everyone suspects was a sergeant in the Joint Liaison Division. Also, the jollof rice helped. If this story moved something in you, if some part of you felt the weight of what it means to be found by the right person at exactly the wrong moment, stay, because next time we're going deeper into what the Keth discovered about human courage during the Vorith War. What they found was not what they expected. What they found changed how the collective understood the entire concept of bravery. And it starts with a question no K had ever thought to ask. Why do humans run toward things that are going to hurt them? That story is already waiting. Don't go far.